All right, my friends, let's conclude Don Quixote today. The second part that was not to be, that became, because it's for a second part written by Bayonetta, and the entirety of the text itself, though, of course, always reminding you that the second part was not part of the original conception of the first part. So in thinking about form and that aspect of modernism that Maurice Beebe brought to our consideration, think about the fact that this is in fact a two-part novel, which was meant to be one, but is now considered to, though made of two parts that were autonomously that were first created or birthed in the mind of Cervantes in separate moments, that they are now considered and often called one. And so that is a strange thing about the form of this text. So what was one was then made two, which was made one again. There was one part that was one book, there were two parts to the one book, and or there were then two parts created, and those two parts are now appended within the binding and the pages of one single volume. All right. At the end of our conversation last class, we met the Duke and the Duchess hawking. And I mentioned to you that this is one of the elite activities that indicate that, in fact, the Duke and the Duchess are of elite status, noble status. Hawking and hunting are two of the key activities of the idle, the desoccupado, the leisurely class. Though you will have noted earlier on, when you first got your description of Don Quixote, who is himself of the minor nobility, not a Don, but himself owns his own land, has a servant, has a library, well, had a library with 300 books in it. But remember that prior to his reading, he was very into hunting. He himself was a hunter. We met the Duke and the Duchess. The Duke and the Duchess also, recall, are literate and have read the first part of Don Quixote. And so when they address Don Quixote, after finding out that they're speaking to Don Quixote, their favorite character from their favorite book, which they read at night, much to the consternation of the ecclesiastic who stays with them to keep their household a good Christian household, they think, oh my goodness, Don Quixote and Sancho, we must invite them into our home. And because we know the state of the sanity of Don Quixote, and in fact, the Duchess thinks that Sancho is just as crazy as Don Quixote, because the fact that he believes her when she says that in fact Dulcinea is enchanted, based on the end of our lecture last time. We know that we are in for some hijinks. Yes, and part of the indication that the Duke and the Duchess have they have knowledge of Don Quixote very similar to the knowledge that we, the readers, have of Don Quixote, except only up to a point, only up to the end of the first part. And they indicate this gap in knowledge, not having themselves access to the second part, which at this point would have been being written or lived out. They refer to Don Quixote as the Knight of the Sorrowful Face. As we know from chapter 17 and the episode of the Lions, Don Quixote is no longer called the Knight of the Sorrowful Face. He is now called the Knight of the Lions. After the Duke and the Duchess invite Don Quixote to their home, they send word to their servants to make sure to let them know to treat Don Quixote as a chivalric knight, to make the house into a surrealist sort of magical kingdom. And in fact, the house is itself a castle. And according to the Duke, not the only castle that he has. He is a Duke, after all. If you know 20th century Italian fascism, you know that Mussolini, the dictator of the fascist state of Italy during World War II, it's called Il Duce, the leader. Duke means leading person. It's sort of like prince, which comes from princeps, which means first. In any case, as Don Quixote approaches and enters this castle, where he is finally being treated like a knight, he has a thought that might cause us to pause when we consider whether he is insane, deluded, or acting out of fiction consciously. At length, the Duke came out to take her down, as the Duchess, And as they entered the spacious court, two fair damsels, and noted spacious court, two fair damsels. Do any of you read so closely that you know that this is obviously a recreation of the first inn scene, where the inn is approached as a castle? Two ladies of the evening, prostitutes, approach and are treated as damsels. You see the brilliance of this writing here? Perhaps you will. Came forward and threw over Don Quixote's shoulders a large mantle of their finest scarlet cloth. And at the same instant, all the galleries of the court were lined with men servants and women servants of the household, crying, "Welcome, flower and cream of knight errantry." That's an interesting expression. We still have creme de la creme in French, cream of the crop. Wow, which means best of the best. While one of one, as we say these days, sui generis. While all or most of them flung pellets filled with scented water over Don Quixote and the Duke and the Duchess. At all, this is what's important. At all which Don Quixote was greatly astonished. Greatly astonished. He shouldn't be astonished. He should be used to this sort of greeting. And this was the first time that he thoroughly felt and believed himself to be a knight errant in reality, and not merely in fancy. What is this? Now that he saw himself treated in the way as he had read of such knights being treated in the days of yore. This is very curious. We recall the conversation between Sancho and Tome Cecil, the knight of the mirrors' squire, where they talked about who is more insane, the person who chooses to be insane or the person who cannot help but be insane. And they decided that the person who cannot help but be insane is, in fact, the more insane persons, to some extent, the basis of the work S2025 by Joseph Heller, where there's a character, Musarian, who, since he claims that he is crazy, people say he's sane enough to know that he's crazy, and so he can stay in a war or positions in there. So this really is quite confusing. This is the first time that Don Quixote truly feels that he's a knight. What has been going through his head the entirety of this story during all of these episodes where he has claimed over and over again that he is knight, that he is afflicted by enchanters, that Sancho is a squire, and that there are differing ways of acting and even differing physical reactions based on the Balm of Fierro. Remember that, whether one is a knight or not a knight. Was all of that a conscious fiction that Don Quixote was revealing to us? Or is it the fact that he is deluded, but that he experienced some doubt himself? And did that doubt come from his interactions with the characters around him, or some amalgamation of those interactions? It does seem like over and over again, he runs into people that do not grant him his conceits. Say, this is not a castle, this is an inn. This is not your lover, this is Maritornes who's trying to find a goat herd. This is not a giant, it's a windmill. This is not a prison with a noble lord within it. It is a mill with water wheels alongside it, over and over and over again. One would think that he would get the point at some point, and one wonders whether he was starting to, as a result of the massive amounts of information he has been receiving during the entirety of his quest. All right. Remember, too, that chapter 33, 2 chapters after this one, chapter 31, is when Sancho got to speak to the Duchess, and this is where he reveals that he thinks his master is mad, but the Duchess says, no. Though you convinced your master that Dulcinea was in fact this peasant woman and has been enchanted, and you think that makes him crazy, it is in fact the case that Dulcinea was enchanted by one of the enchanters that inflict this house. Sancho is then convinced by the Duchess, and as a consequence of him being convinced by her spurious and sort of fanciful reasoning, she now thinks that Sancho is mad. And so let's pull back from thinking that Don Quixote is always the idealist, seeing a world that isn't, pursuing a golden age, and that Sancho is the realist, earthy, loves food, loves to sleep, sees things as they are. At this particular moment between chapters 31 and 33, we seem to see a shift. Don Quixote now accepting that he's a chivalric knight, but under the suggestion that he must have been doubting it. in his mind of minds. It's not a purely idealistic way of seeing things. And then now Sancho accepting the presence of magic and enchantment in his world after seeming to be such a hard-nosed realist. Are these two characters now starting to affect, or in this case, afflict each other? Now, I mentioned extremely quickly, and I'm going to have to mention almost as quickly, that based on what Sancho says about the cave of Montesinos to the Duchess, she then talks to the Duke about this and integrate that story into their plans. They decide to go on a hunt and to have a sort of enchanted procession go about in front of Don Quixote. Why? Well, mostly for their amusement. Remember that all of this is being done to amuse the Duke and the Duchess, and to some extent they are like us. They are the readers, but they get to engage with that which they have read. It would be like if you got to, if a character from a book you love jumped out into reality, and you got to entertain them for a couple of days, or if you got sucked into a book, though the conceits might be different. In any case, this procession, there's several enchanters that go by. There is the enchanter Merlin there as well, just similar to Montesinos down in the cave of Montesinos. And we get to meet the Countess Trifaldi, the Dolores Duenas, who are Duenas. A dueña is an older non-childbearing woman who helps with a house. There's a sort of an old negative connotation that they are also panderers, that they like to hook up young men and women together. And so it's sort of a slightly, it is an interesting role for one to occupy in one of these 17th century households. But in any case, these dueñas, females, have been afflicted with long gray beards by a giant named Malambruno. Something I wish to mention here, however, is that all of the names in this procession themselves relate back or point back to the fact that they are constructed in order to be in the story. What do I mean? There is a character named Don Clavijo. Clavijo means peg. And Clavileño, who is a wooden horse. That means small little peg. This is a small little wooden horse. Antonomasia, a character involved in this. Her name means, it's actually a literary term that we have, which means to name something by substitution. If you call somebody who dates a lot, like a man who dates a lot, a Don Juan, that's an instance of antonomasia. Trifaldi means three skirts, and Malambruno means evil dark thing, basically. Okay, well, what happens? We are told that these Dolores Dueñas can only be saved and relieved of their terrible beards by Don Quixote and Sancho riding on a wooden horse, which is itself full of fireworks. They are told that it is a magical flying horse that is going to take them many leagues in order to fight against Malambruno. But in fact, it is going to be a wooden horse that explodes underneath their legs. Now, very strange thing happens here. Obviously, what we would expect happens. The Don Quixote and Sancho are put on the horse, the fireworks are set off, and there's a huge explosion that makes everybody laugh. However, at the end of the journey through the sky, from a realist perspective, obviously these two individuals do not go through the sky, though one might sort of, or as a pale allegory, start to think, going into a cave into the dark, kind of similar to going into the sky, right? Like, where is your head at? Or is your head in the clouds, as it were? A cave, as well as the sky, these can both be places of the imagination, right? Places where you cannot see normal distinctions, things. When you're in the sky, you're so high up. When you're in a cave, there's no light. And so one wonders whether Don Quixote and Sancho are both being set up in the cave of Montesinos and on the noble steed Clavileño as both being afflicted by seeing with the eye of their imagination. And in so seeing with the eye of their imagination, not seeing that which is real. Which there are just two things that I would like to mention that I really want to talk about when we get to our seminar, which are these. In this particular text, the notion of personal truth you might replace by imagination. The idea that Don Quixote himself can see that which others cannot is not a bad idea. However, the evidence of the text seems to suggest that he does not see correctly. Though you could really make an argument that he is the one that sees correctly, but you would have to make an argument not that he has a personal truth in that case, but that he is the one who sees the truth, though all others do not. The other thing I want to mention here is that something to keep in mind is that this is not an argument that words transform reality. This is an argument that narratives and stories transform reality. Much different, much more robust. Like saying that a pie crust transforms hunger as opposed to a pie, saying that words rather than stories affect one's reality. It is the case that words have value. It is far more the case that stories have much greater value. It's the stories that you are told and that you hear that form you into who you are. It's the stories that you tell other people that largely form their opinions of you. The words that you use are like the ornaments on the tree, but they are not the tree itself. And so keep that in mind when thinking about the power of story or the power and the power of words to affect one's perception. Far more the claim of this text that it is the stories you consume that affect what you think, not just the words, though the words do matter. Obviously, we know this from Sancho constantly misspeaking and Don Quixote correcting him, though Sancho has had to ask him multiple times not to, because he would never be able to spit out what it is that he had to say if he always had to mind his words around Don Quixote. Okay, that said, this wooden horse on the ground has these fireworks set off, and after Sancho and Don Quixote, who have been blindfolded so that they don't see this, have the blindfolds removed, it seems that we have some evidence given to us for the perspective of the Duchess seeing Sancho as crazy, because all of a sudden he comes out with a very, very descriptive story about having seen multiple constellations in the sky, including the Pleiades, which has something like 7 goats in it. And he says he could even name the color of each one of these goats. And so a more complicated question than even is Sancho going crazy would be that if Sancho doubted the veracity of what Don Quixote saw in the cave of Montesinos, he thinks not that Don Quixote is lying, but that he is in error, that he is saying some sort of error. There's also a very famous cave in the background of this. Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, English Renaissance epic, has a very famous episode of the Cave of Error. There's some famous caves in all literature, also Plato's cave, of course, also, which is a similar representation, as it were. In any case, Sancho has heard Don Quixote say what he said about Montesinos, doesn't believe it. Now he has an opportunity, after having been blindfolded in the same way that Don Quixote had his eyes closed when he was pulled back out of the cave of Montesinos, he has a chance now to give his perception of what happened. Did he in fact see the Pleiades and all of these different colors, or did he imagine it? And if he did imagine what he saw, does he feel free to represent that as true, given the fact that that is what he thinks Don Quixote does? And in any case, this, to make a broader, less subtle point, seems to be indication that Sancho is himself becoming more quixotic, is devolving from sane into insane himself. All right, yes, and so right after Sancho says this, Don Quixote sidles up next to him and says to him, Sancho, just as you want to believe what you have seen in the sky, I want you to believe what I saw in the cave of Montesinos. I want you to believe. Seems to be, again, an element of doubt there. Not, this was true, but I wish you would believe what I'm telling you. little bit weaker of a statement. And again, of course, compare this to what we just read. And this was the first day he really knew and believed he was the true knight errant, not a fantastic one, for he saw himself treated in the manner in which he had read knights were treated in the past ages. This is itself an interesting bit of epistemology. What makes Don Quixote think that he is actually a chivalric knight? He sees himself treated in the same manner as the knights which he had read were treated. Okay, but how has he been treated throughout the entirety of the text? Often like a crazy buffoon. And yet, when presented with that evidence, it falls totally flat on him. You might say that this is somebody who is afflicted with the confirmation bias. If I give you multiple choice and you choose A, I say, okay, are you sure it's A? And you're like, yeah, I don't need to see B, C, or D. And the answer is D. It's like, well, you never will actually see the truth once you think you have it, because there's no longer any need to look for it. So Don Quixote, in having the truth, his personal truth, what we might call a deluded imagination, in this case, in having the truth, it must have been everybody else that was making the mistake. And so the one time he is actually treated as a knight, this serves as what? Absolute confirmation that he has been correct all along. If you become a thinker of the nature of Don Quixote, you should certainly be ashamed to call yourself such. All right, chapters 42 to 53, and there's a 71 chapter part. Sancho is given his insula. Now, of course, there are many hijinks and jokes that happen during it that we're not going to be able to talk about. But one thing I will say about it is it is called the insula barataria, which itself means to barter, to attain cheaply, or to deceive. Very interesting Spanish word there. And Sancho is removed from the presence of Don Quixote. While Sancho rules, Don Quixote has his own drama with a woman called Altisidora, which is itself a fake name applied to one of the servants in the household, and very Sir Gawain and the Green Knight-esque. It is a story of seduction, very much in the style of what we saw with Maritornes, though funny in its own slightly different ways. I only want to say about these 11 chapters or so, 2 or 3 things. Prior to Sancho going to be the governor, Don Quixote spends a couple of chapters telling him how to be a governor. And here are a few of the maxims that he gives to him. Don't let subjective law rule his mind. Be compassionate to the poor. Always look for the truth among the bribes and the sobs. Be merciful and let pity have a say in your decisions. Always focus on facts and don't twist them to injure enemies. It's kind of a funny thing to say, given Don Quixote. Don't insult a punished man. Remember the criminals are human. I'll tell you, I've known many officers of the law. It's something important for them to keep in mind. One's job starts to affect one's subjective reality, by the way. You start to spend a lot of time seeing things as they are within your own sphere of influence. And so that becomes what your world is. So choose your worlds correctly. Show mercy without injuring the innocent. I think that's very important. It's important to show mercy, but not at the expense of one's integrity, and often not at the expense of justice on somebody else's account. And on and on. I think I even have a second page of this. Right. Oh, yes. I guess one thing I'll mention at the end of this is that Don Quixote continually ridicules the intellect of Sancho. He's uneducated, he's illiterate, he speaks in proverbs that are often not to the point and often don't make sense. And so Don Quixote sees Sancho as a fool who will obviously be a poor leader. And yet, even though he has his doubts about Sancho's ability to govern, Sancho reveals a bit of emotionality that seems to show his true character at the end of Don Quixote's harangue or screed here. He says, if you think I'll be a bad governor, Don Quixote, I'll give it up. Even though that's what you promised me in the first place, if you think I'll do a terrible job, I don't need it. And I would rather serve in heaven than be a governor in hell, which will about 60 years later become a very, very, very famous line in John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. Here, Sancho says quite the opposite. Don Quixote tells Sancho that due to this sentiment alone is worthy to govern, that he's got his heart in the right place, and so all the skill will follow. And if he follows God, Don Quixote himself being sort of a religious man, in some ways more than others, given his love of fantasy literature. As a result of this, Sancho goes off to govern, and Don Quixote returns or remains at the castle. All right. I'm going to very quickly tell the story of Altisidora. While Don Quixote, and the chapters go back and forth between the two during this section, so thinking about form, you might also reflect on that. Don Quixote hears at night a person serenading him and singing a song of love to him, which makes him pretty nervous because he, though obviously such an attractive, almost one-eared, teeth-missing old knight, eligible bachelor that he is not on the market. He loves Dulcinea, regardless of whether she's real or not. There's not a question that he is interrogating at this particular moment. Altisidora sings for him. He finds out that he was sung for at night, and the very next night, he decides to sing for Altisidora. I really want to present that to you. But while he is serenading Altisidora, underneath her window, remember that this is all being put together by the Duke and the Duchess's steward for the entertainment of the household of the Duke and the Duchess. They release a tackful of cats onto Don Quixote's head. And you just imagine him singing, "Oh, Altisidora." It's something that visual stimuli would really help to make the joke land. But it won't even get stuck to his face and is clawing him. Eventually, he is rescued, however. And this Altisidora, whom he serenades, and then is afflicted by cats during, and is serenaded by, will be an individual that pops back up at the very end of the text, right before Don Quixote returns home. In fact, he'll be kidnapped by the Duke and the Duchess in order to be brought to a necromancy ritual where Altisidora will have died of sadness from Don Quixote leaving, and will have to come back from the dead. But upon coming back from the dead, she will say something so cruel to Don Quixote that it may start the process of breaking his heart unto his own death. One thing about Sancho, when Sancho is at the Insula, he is first given in sort of folk tale format 3 tests that he must pass, 3 cases that he must judge to show whether he is a wise or a foolish ruler. One of them involves 2 old men. One of them involves a lady who claims that she was ravaged by a man. And the third one involves a country fellow and a tailor. I'm just going to tell you a detail or 2 about these and then move on very fast. The question about the case of the old man and the other old man, that one had lent the other 10 crowns of gold, and the other claims that he had returned it to him. However, the first man claims that he doesn't have it. What turns out to be the case is that when the first man who's walking with the cane, or the second man in this case, says that he has given the 10 gold crowns back to the first man, he says, "Hold my cane. I've given you my 10 golden crowns." Did any of you get what happened there? Sancho says, "Oh, let me see that cane." Opens it up, and there are 10 gold crowns in there. So the second man had given the crowns back to the first man inside of his staff, unbeknownst to the first man, so he was not lying. So it's a tricky thing to decipher what's happening, but Sancho sees through. In the second instance, there's a woman who claims that she was ravaged by a man out of nowhere. It turns out that she was a prostitute and that they had agreed on a certain price, but afterwards, she decided that was not as much money as she could demand from him, so she comes to Sancho to demand more. Sancho then sends them back out and gives the money that's demanded by the woman to her, and sends the man after her, says, now go take it from her again. She comes back in fighting for this sack of money. Sancho thinks, huh, he's not able to take this money from you now. Perhaps if you had, this is an interesting way of looking at this situation, perhaps had you fought like this prior, you would still have what it is that you think that you lost. So again, keep in mind that this, in this situation, is not a damsel in distress so much as a prostitute is trying to extort her John for additional money, and in this case happens to fail to do so. Cuidado, careful about giving her too much of your pity. And then the third case involves a man that is conscripted to make several hats for another man, but since he's given a very limited amount of cloth, he makes tiny hats that would fit on somebody's fingers and says, I still made you your hats, you need to pay me forever. All right, well, okay. Switching slides very quickly here, because there's one slide here that I want to share. Once I press enable. Okay, the end of Sancho's tenure as governor happens when he is woken at night by the sounds of trumpets, war trumpets. There seems to be a battle going on. Something that happens during the course of his reign as governor too is that there is a doctor in his court named Pedro Recia who doesn't allow him to eat anything. And so there's something there about sort of a Midas touch instance going on here. Sancho, even though he's gotten everything that he has been promised, he doesn't have anything that he wants. His day is spent now judging disputes. He's not allowed to eat. He's awakened at night. Being governor is a lot of work. One thing I'll say to you all is that if you ever want to be a CEO of a company, you should know that we have plenty of data on this. The CEOs of Fortune 500 companies often have to work for 20 years in their industry at 16 hours a day in order to make it there. If you really think about 16 hours a day, how much work that is. That's the entire time you're awake. Not them, they probably only sleep 4 or 5 hours a night. But you know, if you want to be a governor, you want to be a CEO, you have to work far more than you might imagine. When we often imagine jobs, we often imagine the accolades or the rewards from the job, right? We don't always think about the job itself and how much it takes. And this seems to be something that Sancho is representing to us. That maybe his life as it was pretty good. He likes onions and garlic. He likes drinking wine out of a sack. He likes being comfortable at home. And he doesn't like being denied food. He doesn't like being awakened in the night. He doesn't like having to lead men into battle. He is, as we recall from his conflict with the large-nosed Tome Cecil, the prosthetically large nose, something of a coward. He was hiding in a tree. We, in fact, actually see during the procession him hide behind the skirts of the Duchess as well. And so, during this fight, he faints. Then he wakes up, he goes to his grave, and he rushes off. A couple pieces of miscellany following Sancho's leaving his government or his governing before we get into the last 13 minutes of this text or so. Sancho then falls into a hole with his gray. The gray is what he calls his donkey in order not to call it a jackass, is his explicit reason. He says he doesn't want to denigrate it by calling it what it is, so he calls it the gray, which is not its name, but also not what it is not. So in fact, right. Don Quixote, after leaving the Duke and the Duchess, finds Sancho, but thinks he is a ghost at first. You can just hear his voice. And, oh, is that Sancho's voice? Sancho is retrieved from the hole. And after Sancho and Don Quixote make their way from the Duke and the Duchess, they meet in chapter 59, now jumping ahead, Don Juan and Don Geronimo in an inn, which Don Quixote actually thinks is an inn. So keep in mind that we're tracing two lines here. The line where Don Quixote goes from idealist / deluded towards realist, or someone seeing things clearly, and Sancho going the opposite direction, from someone who's seeing things sort of realist and correctly and practically to one who's becoming a little more idealist or deluded in this case. And so Don Juan and Don Geronimo are met in an inn. Don Quixote does not mistake this inn for a castle. I guess he has just stayed in a castle, too, as something to keep in mind. We then show him. Now he gets to see the second part, the spurious second part of Don Quixote, written by the Aeneida from Tordesillas. The erroneous version claims a few interesting things. Claims that Don Quixote falls out of love with Dulcinea. Second unbelievable. Claims that Teresa Panza's name is Marie Panza. Juana Gutierrez is what her name was in the first part of the non-spurious Don Quixote. And so nobody seems to be getting her name. Sancho is depicted as a glutton, which he might be, but not a clever one. He doesn't have anything clever to say in the second part. And they break off reading it and decide to go to Barcelona rather than Zaragoza, because that's where Don Quixote and Sancho go in the spurious second part, and also where they claim they are going to go at the end of Cervantes' first part. So in order to spite Avellaneda, and to some extent even himself by showing an inconsistency in his writing, Cervantes sends, or Sede Hamete Benengeli, or the translator, hopefully having done his job right, sends Don Quixote to Barcelona. Now, on to my last slides of the day. In Barcelona, we meet a character named Don Antonio Moreno. Don. He seems to be a city elite rather than a country elite here. He has a house in Barcelona and invites Don Quixote in. There he has a brass head which can talk and tell prophecies. You immediately connect this brass head to Master Pedro and his puppets and his prophetic monkey. Remember that Don Quixote, when talking to the prophetic monkey, had asked the question. I'd be so impressed. I give you 3 points on your first essay. You can answer this. What does the monkey say to Don Quixote? What does Don Quixote ask the monkey? And remember, the monkey doesn't know anything about the future. He knows a lot about the present and a little bit about the past. The monkey whispers in Master Pedro's ear, remember this Gines de Pasamonte. He says, and Gines then, as Master Pedro speaks to Don Quixote, and he says, regarding in the cave of Montesinos, whether what you saw in there was real or not real, true or false. It takes a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. This itself is enraging. Which one is it, is what we strive to ask. We want the distinction, and yet we're not given it. Here, a connection is made. Don Quixote again asks about the cave of Montesinos. Why is he asking about an experience that he had? Why would you ask about an experience that you had? Could it be that you doubt your experience? Did this really happen? Did I say this? Did I really do this? Sort of like if you ever black out and your friends have to tell you what happened afterwards, to say, oh, you think your night ended then? No, it did not. No, it did not. No, what? Please tell me what I did. This seems to be sort of the situation that Don Quixote finds himself in. Asking now questions about something that he experienced himself makes us doubt whether he believes his experience himself. Don Quixote asks the head about the cave of Montesinos and whether what he saw was true. Were true. I can get subjunctive. Contrary to fact clauses were rather than was. It's a mood that we still have in our language. Let it be, for example. Why not let it is? Tell me, you who respond, was my account of what happened to me in the cave of Montesinos the truth or a dream? Will the lashes of my squire be completed? Oh, yes, and that's something that I forgot to mention. Remember that also part of what Don Quixote discovers during the procession with the Duke and the Duchess and the Dolores Dueñas is that Sancho alone can relieve Dulcinea of her enchantment. And the only way he can do it is by receiving 3,300 self-administered lashes on the back that he has to keep count of. No one else will keep count of it for him. And though Don Quixote volunteers, he is not allowed to give the lashes. So this is an absurd amount of lashes. And in fact, it's not determined, but suggested that Sancho not use some nice vine or whip, but use something like a cat of nine tails, which is a nine-headed whip that often has metal on the tips of it. And I don't know if any of you have ever studied torture devices, to any extent, but a whipping using like a traditional whip action sonic boom whip. It makes that sound because it moves so fast that it creates a sonic boom. Something like 50 lashes would leave someone's back irreparably damaged, maybe even 20. And so even just 5 lashes on the back with a solid whip, it would be enough to send you to the hospital, especially as people are these days. So 3,300 is an absurd amount for Sancho to receive, which he claims, and he says, "Why? Dulcinea is Don Quixote's love. What does she have to do with me?" But of course, what she had to do with him, he is the one that came up with the notion that she was enchanted in the peasant girl in the first place. Is this his comeuppance for that? In any case, what does this head now tell to Don Quixote about the cave of Montesinos, whether it was dream or reality? As for the cave, was the response, there is much to say, where it has something of both. Sancho's lashes will go slowly, and the disenchantment of Dulcinea will be duly affected. So it also tells Don Quixote that Sancho will take some time to have his lashes done, but that Dulcinea will eventually be disenchanted and cause some hope to him. Okay, a little bit of modernism here. This Don Antonio Moreno is also a reader, knows that he is entertaining Don Quixote. And so while they go out into Barcelona, wishing to give Don Quixote the experience of being a chivalric knight, while also wanting to laugh at his expense, he has a sign put on the back of Don Quixote that says, "Here is Don Quixote." So as Don Quixote goes through the streets, all the children see him and know him for who he is. That's Don Quixote. And he then takes this as evidence that he in fact is a chivalric knight and has become more and more famous. He's gaining evidence. Knight of the Lions defeated these lions, defeated this knight, now taken to a castle, now taken to a noble house where a head told him that things are going to go pretty well for him. And now these children know him on the street. Things seem to be looking up for Don Quixote. Let's see if I have anything more to say about this. They had a sign attached that read in large letters, "This is Don Quixote of La Mancha." And as they were starting out, the announcement caught the eyes of all the passerby. And since they read, "This is Don Quixote of La Mancha," Don Quixote was surprised. Don Quixote was surprised to see that everyone who looked at him recognized him and knew his name. Turning to Don Antonio, who was at his side, he said, "Great is the prerogative contained within knight-errantry, rendering the man who professes it well known and famous everywhere on earth. Your race will observe, Senor Don Antonio, and even the boys in this city who have never seen you before know who I am." All right, Don Quixote, during his sally through Barcelona, also goes to a book printing shop where he sees several books, including the spurious second part of Don Quixote. He says, "I've already heard of this book," said Don Quixote, "and by my conscience, the truth is I thought it had already been burned and turned to ashes for its insolence. But its day of reckoning will come, as it does to every pig, for feigned histories, like what this history of Don Quixote is in fact. It is in fact a false history. It is a fiction. Just as its writer, the historian Sede Hamadi Benengeli, is a fiction. Just as its translator is a fiction. But feigned histories are good and enjoyable the closer they are to the truth or the appearance of the truth. As for true ones, the truer they are, the better. Is Don Quixote, in fact, a history that comes close to the truth at all, or is it a different genre? I told you that we would meet Sancho and Carrasco again. We met him as the Knight of the Mirrors, where he fell to Don Quixote. He now shows up as the Knight of the White Moon and does not even have a lady love nor a squire. He gets right down to business. He says, "Renowned knight and never sufficiently praised Don Quixote of La Mancha, I am the Knight of the White Moon, whose extraordinary deeds perhaps have come to your attention. I'm here to do battle with you and test your strength, to test the strength of your mighty arms, obliging you to recognize and confess that my lady, whoever she may be," so no longer Casaldea Vandalia, but whoever she may be, sort of like somewhere near La Mancha, I don't care to remember. His name may have been the beginning of Don Quixote, the first part. "Obliging you to recognize and confess that my lady, whoever she may be, is incomparably more beautiful than your Dulcinea Toboso. They set terms. Whoever loses will have to return to La Mancha and not don armor for, I believe, a year. It might be 2 years. I have it written here. In any case, Don Quixote loses. He is felled this time. And in being felled, he agrees to the terms. And he agrees to, with Sancho, immediately return to La Mancha. And on the way back to La Mancha, he starts to talk to Sancho. He says, maybe during our time off, we can be shepherds. And I'll rename myself Shepherd Quixote. You'll be Shepherd Pancina. He even comes up with names for Sancho and Carrasco, the priest and the barber, as well. And thinks about creating a new Arcadia there. While trying to make it home, however, Don Quixote and Sancho are abducted, kidnapped by the Duke and the Duchess in order to watch one final procession where Altisidora, who has died of sadness from Don Quixote leaving their home, will be resurrected. She tells herself a story suggesting that she didn't actually die, but she came very close to death. She came so close to death that she went down to hell and didn't go inside of it, but saw at the gate these demons playing. They were playing a form of pelota, and where instead of having a ball, they had books that they were throwing. And which book is the worst one that they had thrown? They were throwing the second part of Don Quixote, the spurious second part of Don Quixote, which in fact a demon from hell says, I guess all the doublets in college. Good. Oh no, I don't know if I have it written here. In any case, what he says, I'll paraphrase it, this is very close, is I thought that book, which is so bad, had already been consigned to the flames. Because it is it is worse than I could even imagine and worse than I could conceive. In any case, Altisidora now speaks to Don Quixote, not of her vision of the afterlife, but tells her what she really thinks. Good Lord, Don Codfish, another name for him, with a soul of metal like the pit of a date, harder and more stubborn than a peasant when he has his mind set on something. If I ever get you, I'll scratch out your eyes. Do you think by any chance Don defeated, Don battered, 4 names for him, that I died for you? Everything you saw tonight was pretense. Pretense. I'm not the kind of woman who would let herself suffer as much as dirt under my fingernail, much less die on account for nonsense like that. Interesting that she mentions dying for sadness. Does her denouncement of Don Quixote as false help cause his dying of sadness? What does it mean when she says that everything tonight has been pretense? Does that hit Don Quixote, help him to see that much of what he has witnessed in Barcelona, in the castle, in the inns, has been put on for his own entertainment for art? In any case, we then meet a character, I don't have time to talk about this, named Don Alvaro Tarque, from the story of Don Quixote, and Sancho and Don Quixote convinced him that, in fact, he did not meet Sancho and Don Quixote in the spurious second part, and that they are the real ones. I guess I'm just going to have to mention in the first 5 minutes of class on Monday what happens in the very last 2 chapters, because I couldn't quite get there today. So, epilogue on Monday.